The Butterfly's Dream by Kerber's 314, Chapter 20, Second Edition. An entire day which had passed crammed into hours, a world underneath the puddle, a universe of thought distilled into one or two perverting questions. Even something as small as this Naruto didn't have time for as he sped with his team across the elemental nations at what some might consider undue haste. To them it was never enough for the unconquerable paradox they were stuck in. Traveling halfway to the intercept point last night, half of the remaining distance in the next few hours upon waking, half again after that, always halfway and never there, always paradox. Naruto was both proud and disappointed with the way Ruby confronted her bullies, comforted and admittedly a little afraid at what he had witnessed transpire. If it was just an act, it was a good one, and something he never believed that his other capable of. Could she really have hidden something like that from him, or did he willfully ignore it? He didn't know, and that's what scared him. Did there exist a third possibility explaining? Not here, not now, at least. He had his own concerns, which had already been committed to. How much longer Kakashi Taicho? Watch, watches were a luxury in his world and something he never had use for previously. But if he'd had one, they wouldn't be stuck in this eternity waiting, or maybe they still would. And the old adage about watch pots never boiling. From what we gathered of the Kumo team's mission, they would have started heading back from the Hidden Waterfall territory yesterday. The silver-haired man would reply patiently, knowing somehow the blonde had missed this in the debriefing, but in no way holding it against him. Their path will take them past Hidden Sound, and so the Akatsuki will likely strike somewhere in between the two, not wanting to incite either outside forces. We're about 20 minutes out from the most southern route they're likely to take. We're going to want to stay as far away from the latter as well. Feeling unusually chatty, Sasuke added his own 2 cents. Maybe it was because the talk was associated with the hidden sound. Maybe that was his own fear manifesting. Sasuke had made progress, but all life was a struggle against forces inside and out trying to return one to steady state. His more the latter. The timetable was reassuring for Naruto, and being nowhere near Kumagakure was even better. He felt better having his teammate available for backup, especially with monsters like Hisame and Sasuke's brother lurking about. It wouldn't be wise to count on fate smiling on him again, like I did for Deidara. It'd be a good idea in general to keep our eyes peeled from here on out, Naruto's other Genin teammate said, giving him especially a meaningful look as she caught up to the conversation. Be sure to keep your head up, Naruto. To the others, it was a part of friendly jibbing, especially with the adroit smirk on Tenten's face. It was just two comrades giving one another nervous pre-battle chatter. They would not know how reassuring it was for him to have her company just then. She had always been his anchor, and it was good to know he could still count on her for that, not to mention her competence with Sasuke and Kakashi to cover close range with their preoccupative sight. Her long-range capabilities were invaluable. For all else, there was him. There was no plan C. There was still just too many variables to the operation. How many and who exactly they were fighting being one. How capable were the Kumo team in defending themselves? What if they were all dead? And the Jinchuriki captured held against incredible odds by powerful foes? And most importantly, would they be fighting with or against their unwitting allies? Those would be the types of useless questions he eschewed. He no plan surviving first contact after all. Heads drifting down to that comfortable weight at his side. The wrapped shark skin grip struck an odd sensitive sensation under his fingertips. It was the same size and heft as his previous one, which he left back in River Country, which should come as no surprise because they were of the same maker. Yet somehow it felt different. For a while now, even that previously enduring weapon felt, for a better term, lacking. It would have to do, though. The smell of blood hit before the sight, and the foreboding presence just moments before that. That niggling sense was like the death of a Grim as they settled into an accomplished fine dust, so thin as to not even be there, yet invading the mind like a haunting melody. Here it comes. No one needed to ask him what he meant as they dropped down from the canopy to the forest floor, sticky with death. Are we too late? Not in the possession of that fabled dojutsu? Tenten asked as she was incapable of seeing the enemy which caused this slaughter. It's too fresh. They can't have gotten far. Braving the stench, Sasuke inspected one of the nearest Kumo ninja, flies not yet feasting on the man's exposed entrails. But where there were too many frenzied footsteps layered on top of another, layered one on top of the other to track, and Kakashi's ninja hounds would have nothing to hunt even if they could smell anything past the solid smell of blood. The pulse of energy, like a sideways atmosphere slamming into them, made this question superficial. Turning against the instinct which drove them away, they traced it back to its source. The feeling emanated from a narrow crevice which they knew they'd have to enter. It was a rent into the sheer cliff, a face rising out of the earth, taller than the treetops, a vertical lightning strike of a gap only half again as wide as a man with his arms outstretched. A horrible place to be trapped, but that was for sure. Further fighting their common sense, they had to follow the sounds of fighting into the mall. Naruto, you go first. You'll have the best chance at surrounding the enemy if we travel single file. Unless the Krang open up past the mouth, there would be no room to skirt a fight, and Naruto would be an explosive in a contained space. I'll leave one of my summons here as a message. Something tells me we won't have very good radio contact once inside. They would proceed without further ado, but with cautious haste through the widening passageway. It was impossible to see the combatants, but equally impossible to ignore the ferocious sounds of battle echoing down the walls. How anyone was able to conduct a fight in this situation, much less survive an ambush against two S-ranked opponents, was anyone's guess. It wouldn't be long until they found out, staring at the two black-cloaked bags. Motherfucker, there ain't enough room in this shithole for me to use the ritual. Quit whining. It also means that she can't use the Two Tails transformation, or do you want to have to deal with getting eaten? Just be patient. Patient. This from a guy who's always telling me not to waste his precious time. That's because time is money, but I'd rather be alive to bring my bounty in. They could have interrupted Kotsky's argument with a snappy retort, something about how neither of them would be around to collect it, but having two of the shinobi world's most dangerous criminals in the most compromising position one could hope for was just too good a position not to exploit. There would be an explosion of action and enough swear words to break the bank, tossed around and reflected in that acoustic trap. It was a bottle chaos for about 5 seconds in which attacks were funneled as neat as could be managed, careful not to hit allies or the target which none had still laid eyes on. The rock walls on either side would not let the fog off or dissipate, and Naruto cursed this as he hopefully landed on the other side of the Tuakatsuki. A hand shifted his orange scarf over his nose to stave off the fine particulate from entering his lungs as he watched the meandering shadows with anticipation. Ducking his head and dropping to his knees only moments before a blade gave him an overdue haircut, he lamented leaving his once iconic goggles at home as the chalky dust made his eyes watery. Once on the ground, as flat as a snake, he rolled quickly to avoid the stab he could hear descending upon him. He stopped as he came up against the immutable stone, ripping his mask off his face so he could bellow a warning. Wait, stop! We're here to help! Though there would be no choice but to defend the next strike, aimed to crucify him to the wall, though he would have enough instinct to latch onto his attacker and hold them in place. Hear me out. We're not your enemy. We're fighting that Kotsky just like you. Words became static as the slender wrist in his grip exploded in electricity. He might have screamed, but amidst the rest of the cacophony, it would matter little. Still, he would hold on, electricity signals so compelling his muscles to clench and thus unable to release. Not enemies, friends. Like you. It wasn't so much his words that cut the current coursing through his body, but the fact that he could resist as much electric potential with such dogged resistance. Your Konoha shinobi, voiced like an Italian soda, now melted into a watery mess by the constant heat she'd been under. What the hell are you doing here? And what do you mean that you are friends? She would have broken his now limp grip with ease, but didn't because there was a feeling her question would be answered in but little time. The demon inside of her, who had been chomping at the bit for some time now, was now oddly silent at the accidental contact. I am a, I am a ginger. His tongue was numb. Perhaps he'd taken a little bit too much abuse, though he couldn't make up his mind on that. Another sign, he said, was scrambled. Which one? The woman staring at him with scimitar eyes didn't need any more speech, and only his shaking hands to hold up two almost full sets of fingers for her to be satisfied. What are you doing here? His answer was to lurch suddenly against her, pressing, latching on in her shock, and ignoring the blade as she jammed against his neck. Her next sensation was disconcerting vertigo, still sandwiched between two walls of rock, but with nothing underneath to ground her. There was a grunt as the blonde inter-director slammed against the side and slapped his palm against the rock, hoping to get a handhold before they dropped down into the renewed smoke cloud beneath them. He must have managed to stick himself using chakra against the rough surface, because his other hand shot out and grabbed her wrist again, her body swinging like a pendulum towards the side of the crag. Like a gymnast, she managed her feet to meet the hackly surface, sticking there with much the same purpose. Resisting the urge to praise his quick thinking, she looked up with a cocked eyebrow to see the tin hanging from one stiff arm and a hooked blade jammed into the rocky surface. What kind of person had the chakra control for the shunshin drilled inside their head, but not something as basic as wall walking? Naruto was still more than a little messed up from being electrocuted, but was able enough to dodge the hail of thread-like tentacles which had threatened to spear them. His hands and feet were still numb, but that didn't prevent him from drawing the Kusarigama on instinct alone to save him from a nasty fall. He doubted that Jujutsu would have done him the favor of catching him, even if he did save both of their lives. Suppose I believe you. Jujutsu began regaining some of that coolness which seemed appropriate for someone like her, despite the hollow black beads of the bandaged Akatsuki members staring up at them. You got a plan? The zombie-like man on the ground raised a hand to the sky, but before he could do more than lift a finger more at them, he was besieged by flames which engulfed him and the entire crag like a river. I didn't come alone. Naruto managed to get out past the strain of maneuvering himself against the crumbling wall. So, who are these guys? After a brief pause of hesitation, Yujiro gave him a harried rundown on their two opponents. The immortality part was worrying, but neither of them had displayed any skills which looked too troublesome to overcome or too fast to outrun. With the Sharingan, the best was more benefit than determination from what they could see. His teammates were holding their own for now. Kakashi found himself against Kakazu, the ex-Waterfall shinobi, who was a Frankenstein monster of his own making, with all the benefits of that monstrosity and none of the detriments. The piecemeal approach to his humanity, allowing him to control the very threads which held his body together, and have plenty of spare parts apparently. Sasuke was seemingly playing with Hidan, the foul-mouthed disciple of a cruel god who took his immortality as permission to forego any semblance of subtlety. The Konoha shinobi struck countless blows against the juggernaut, avoiding the cumbersome triple blade scythe, fate being ironic again, it seemed, but no luck in filling him thus far. Tenten was supporting his raven-haired comrade from behind them where she could, hurrying the silver-haired acolyte with well-placed kunai, but having scant opportunity in this cramped battleground. In order to use her closer-ranged weapons, she'd somehow have to get past the two in front of her, though from what he'd just learned, maybe it was better she'd stay far away from the scythe's long reach. One did not want to get injured by Hidan, not only for the obvious, but even a scratch would allow the man to conjure countless more wounds on his target. Which one do you want? He saw Yujito glance hatefully at the Joshinist, his half-naked form being exercised by her cat-like eyes, as if she could eviscerate him from their perch far above. Then she shook it off and leaped off the wall towards Kakuzu. Naruto would be lying if he didn't prefer it this way. No matter how capable Tenten proved herself, he would always feel responsible for protecting her. He too jumped towards the fray. Would you slink, quit, clang, moving around? He done took another lumbering swing at the wily Uchiha, his massive blade proving a deterrent in this close quarters battle and scraping loudly against the rock wall. Though he was not an elite for nothing, it was matching the young Uchiha prodigy's skills with the blade despite the disadvantage of maneuverability. Sasuke looked almost bored as he used his physical speed to dodge the telegraphed blow, taking another hack with his electricity-covered sword at the offensive ugly scythe, but declined to get too close to the immortal who'd already survived several stabs, electricities, electric, electrocutions, and emulating pincushion when Tenten had first paved their way. None of the wounds he'd inflicted, shallow or otherwise, had slowed the scythe wielder down much, and the man's religious devotion somehow was able to override any of the dojutsu's illusionary techniques. He could say he was biding his time, but for what? None of his physical attacks had much effort. If only he had the Matarasu, the 7-day burning flame, would surely occupy the man for enough time. Now he was merely waiting for inspiration from above. It just so happened his prayers were delivered. Why should I hold still? Sasuke asked mockingly, resting his blade in the crook of his elbow. You're just too slow to catch me anyway, you little cocksucker, Hidan swore violently as he angled the massive scythe parallel to the walls and charging with a blind fury. Only at the last few steps did it become something more than a petulant child throwing a tantrum. The pale man drove his weapon into the ground and vaulted over Sasuke. Uchiha took the opportunity to reach out and try to pluck him out of the sky, but had to abandon this attempt as the man's scythe trailed after him on a seemingly indestructible chain connected to his wrist. It jerked and lunged at Sasuke in an eccentric path, its movements being controlled by the man at the other end. Sasuke might have considered himself an exceptional swordsman, but the Konoha shinobi also considered himself lucky to avoid the raking blade with only a small scratch along his shoulder. Aha! Now I've got you. Prepare to die, fucker. Sneering past the stinging pain, Sasuke turned back at the inordinately eccentric man and scoffed. You're still too slow. We'll see about that. What? Hidan had to lean on the shaft of his weapon as he tripped amid stride. You're not bad with that scythe, gotta say. The chain around the arrayed man's ankles constricted and he toppled over, having his weapon and equally sharp words around willy-nilly. But Sasuke's right. You're not nearly fast enough. Like I said, we'll see about that. With the fervency only a religious zealot could possess, he struck blindly at the air above him, just in time to catch an orange and black figure face in above him, with a particularly small scythe raised above his head. Not so slow now, am I, you dig licker? The prone man yelled at the blond shinobi who had tried to get the drop on him, the whelp staring cross-eyed at the blade embedding in his head before he disappeared in a puff of smoke. The fuck? Too slow? The words, like the parent admonishing, came once again from behind, as did the invisible fast sweep, which passed over him like a wraith. Hidan looked confusingly at his now stump of an arm, cut cleanly at the elbow and bleeding like a geyser as he sat up. Huh, now this has potential. Reluctantly, Takatsuki looked over his shoulder to see the same blonde he'd skewered, admiring his scythe, the other end of the chain connected to his severed arm. That's mine, you piece of shit! The newcomer flicked his attention at Hidan, then hefting the ungainly weapon over his shoulder and cocking his head playfully. Come and get it. For a man recently deprived of his right arm, the S-rank Noonkin did not seem to be too much inhabited uninhibited as he freed himself from the kusarigama chain wrapped around his legs and wiped the blade side of the weapon at Naruto, who batted it away with a careless nudge with his trophy. Come on, don't be petty now. I'll show you petty, motherfucker. The sound like a grinding rock stopped as Hidan's gnashing teeth stained with a with teeth stained into a stinging smirk. Naruto was disturbed for the first time in the fight. Not even the arm trailing on the other end of his new weapon had much impact as that crazy smile sprouted on the devout man's face. He recognized the state of insanity even if it had never been directed at him. Behind the madness, however, he managed to overlook the method. Tenten, he ordered with a straight face, not willing to waste any more time on this abomination. That's right. Go ahead and ask your bitch girlfriend to join us for the fun. His words never faltered, not even when said girl sent a handful of kunai straight into the man's spine, not even when the whole cavernous battlefield heard the snake-like hiss of a half-dozen explosive tags burning away in the sudden silence. His smile was consumed by the orange flames, and the maniacal snickering overcame by the bellowing blast which assaulted their eardrums. Naruto lowered his canvas-sleeved arm, which protected his face from debris, to reveal a slight frown. Even if the man was immortal, he shouldn't be coming back from that explosion like that. Right? Then why did he feel like it was too easy? Thanks for that, cunt. Now listen to the emo kid scream. There was no time to parse the strange word out, and no time to see where the attack had come from, which failed his sour-faced comrade. Sasuke, the teen scream, were mostly of surprise as he collapsed to a knee, the other spasming slightly as dark blood soaked into his pants from behind. That's right, scream, cry. Your laments are elogious for Joshin. One hand reached out to his comrade. Naruto turned to look up at the rock wall where not long ago he'd been surveying the battle. Now he found Hidan there, stuck to the crevice wall amidst the crimson drawing, the silver-haired man, looking far more morbid with skeletal markings all over, but conversely unharmed from the explosion. In fact, the only wound he had apart from the missing arm was a self-inflicted kunai wound in his thigh, right where Sasuke's injury was. Naruto's face paled as white as the bone marking painted on Hidan's now black skin. Jujito had told him about this technique, and how so many of her comrades had already fallen to the bloodthirsty man, but not how it worked or how to overcome it. Guts tensed along with his hands and his heart as he split his attention between the laughing man and his writhing comrade. He could do nothing, not so long as whatever hold Hidan held over Sasuke remained. He was disgusted with himself for being so helpless, but also with the man. This kind of connection, it was not dissimilar from his and Ruby's. In a way, it was the piece they had been missing all this time. Actual physical coalescence. Another voice started to laugh, and he wanted to silence it then and there with the executioner blade still in his hand, but it was Sasuke. Such a small wound, not even a scratch. The dark-haired chuckled behind gritting teeth and hand clenched around his invisible wound. Pathetic. There's no way I can be this pathetic, can I? It was a rhetorical question, but Naruto felt like he should answer. Dissuade his comrade from this notion. There was nothing coming to mind, though. Everything had been reversed so quickly that he was still trying to jog up to the here and now and find some way out of this mess. Naruto, the voice was calm, but there was that same maniac lisp behind it. Was the whole world going mad? Don't worry about me. This is nothing. Show that asshole just what Konoha shinobi are supposed to be like. Show him what strength is really like. He cried as he untwisted the kunai in his leg, the man himself echoing it in ecstasy. I'll not give him the pleasure of seeing me succumb. It was easier said than done, but Naruto had no choice as he countered to his feet. Head once bowed and now snapped up to glare at the cackling one-armed man, and for the first time noticed the esoteric markings the man was standing on. inscribed in the side of the cliff face, with the blood still spewing from his severed arm. They were seals, odd and unknown to him, but if they worked anything like the ones he'd been dabbling in, he knew how to undo them. Just hang in there for a little bit, Sasuke. He hefted the triple blade of his shoulders and planted the pole in the ground, other hands morphing into the only one-handed seal he knew he could do. This just seems to be my fight, you know. When he disappeared, he didn't hear his friends whisper, "That's the problem. You make everything your fight, leaving nothing for the rest of us." "So you think you got balls, brat?" The ghastly visage of Hidan's transmutated form twisted at him, raising the bloody kunai over his chest. "Go ahead, cleave me in two, and let's see what happens to your little friend. Tough little fucker's ready to die, but are you ready to let him?" "No," Naruto admitted, not stopping in his stride as he blitzed sideways across the rock wall at the Akatsuki, whose iconic cloak shrugged off and hung limply towards the ground. The entirety of the depraved man's Makarov tattoos were now on display. "Harkin, Death, we're not going to be ready to let someone die, but—" Hiran's eyes were already opened wide in perverse pleasure and battle lust, but as the young man neared him with his own blade trailing behind and gouged up the rock's wall, the bloodshot irises nearly bugged out of his head. He was immortal, invincible, and yet that unassuming kid was on his personal crusade against everything the Jashinus stood for, not merely his religion or his beliefs, but aiming to eradicate everything that he represented with one swing. There was no stopping him. It was so naive it made him laugh. He was laughing all the while Naruto swung the cumbersome blade up and across as he leapt horizontally into the center of the chasm, the three blades tearing more than slicing the rock wall and eviscerating the man's sacrifice in a spray of heterogeneous debris, mixed rock and human remains falling like hail to the ground below. "Ha ha ha ha! Stupid little fuckers! You just killed your friend." He wasn't so mad that the brat had stolen his sacrifice from him, for even his torso sailed through the air. He picked out the two figures still tied to the ground, watching the dark-haired man's last moments with gleeful anticipation. Then Sasuke stood up, leaning shakily on his sword, but stood nonetheless only to smirk up at Hidan once he was on his feet. "No! What did you do?" There was no chance to see Naruto, as he had no control over the fall, but he knew the whelp heard him and could feel the blade, his own blade, descend upon him. Rather than slice him up some more, the back of the scythe batted his flailing and dismembered torso towards the earth, where it landed in a small crater. "You'll have to explain to me how you knew how to sever his connection," Sasuke told Naruto as he landed next to him. The scythe wielder helped his comrade limp over to their other teammate, treading as far away from the groaning corpse of Hidan as possible in that narrow corridor. "I won't stand for being so helpless again." "All I did was disrupt his seal," Naruto said simply, ignoring the coveting in Sasuke's demand and giving Tenten a small smile as he handed off the young man to her. "When I cut him, I made sure to break the rock with the pentagram first." "Hm," contemplative, impatient so. "That is actually a nice blade," Tenten commented, appraising the three upturned crescents as it rested on the ground. "All that rock, and it's not even dull. What are you going to do with it?" He had to smirk at the poorly veiled request in his friend's eyes. Everyone around him was just like an open book. He couldn't help but wonder if it was just him, or if they really weren't aware of all the innuendo in words, all the meaning left unsaid. "Probably keep it. I need I need a replacement after all." "What? Mine's not good enough for you?" She swayed her hip accusatory, and the sickle had found its way back around her waist. "I noticed you just left it there to be stepped on and blown up." Despite the light tone, he swayed underneath the weight of that accusatory eyebrow. "Way I see it, you owe me one." "Well, I really don't need this many blades. Which one would you do? Deal." She could make use of that high quality metal. What do we do about this, though?" They could always count on Sasuke to be the voice of reason when Neji was absent. his mildly annoyed words directed at the hobbled corpse trying to drag its way out of the crater it had been planted in. The two other teammates looked down at the slightly pathetic remains of the Akatsuki, wondering once again if they had merely gotten lucky or if all of their members were really this easy. Barely Itachi, of course. A pained cry and the sound of a raging torrent shattering stone further on down the chasm suggested the prior. As Kakashi and Yujuto were still engaged with their enemy, he was forced to conclude that the opponents he faced were disadvantaged and unprepared for his competence. This would not last forever, of that he was sure. To that end, he knew they should try to take care of the unknown enemy as swiftly and thoroughly as possible, along with setting their current engagement. It just so happened that he had a plan to satisfy both. Tenten, can you get Sasuke out of here? I'm perfectly capable of getting along on my own. Stubbornly, the boy rejected the shoulder he was leaning on, wincing only once as he put weight on his wounded leg. What are you going to do? She asked with a gaze narrowing in suspicion, ignoring the obstinate Uchiha, and tried to understand what her teammate was doing, rooting around with a hand in his jacket. Even if he really can't die, I'm going to make sure no one ever tries to put him back together again. After making sure his friends were well on their way out of the treacherous pass, Naruto walked calmly up to Hidan, who was cursing up a storm with his fingers jammed in his ears to avoid having to hear such profanity. Be quiet, would you? He took out the manual earplugs just so that he could slap an inscribed note over the irate man's mouth and to pin down his remaining hand with a kunai to make sure he didn't try to remove it. Stay! Then he would make his way over to where Kakashi and Yujito were still dealing with Kakazu, posting another 2 dozen of the same tags along his way. Hidan's partner was indeed much more proficient than the cultist. Such a thing was to be expected with 100 years of experience beneath his belt, and being so close to immortal himself meant that Kakazu was so wily as well as powerful, the former a trait that Naruto ascribed to himself and Ruby, and counted it as one of their major advantages. They did have another, though, unpredictability. You've proved to be of some amusement, Sharingan no Kakashi. The one addressed breathed hard as he tried to recover from multiple chakra-intensive techniques in a row. The landscape of the battle itself had changed, and the gray-haired shinobi could say that he was simply lucky he hadn't been caught up in any of those cataclysmic events. But now, honestly, it's proving a little irritating. The bounty on your head would be quite the tidy sum, but it's not worth nearly as much as invoking the leader's wrath, so I will ask that you surrender now and leave the two-tails jerky to me. Kakashi glanced with his exposed pinwheel eye at the disheveled Kumo Kunoichi by his side. It was clear that he would not be able to rely on her for backup anymore, as the partial transformation into the Navy had all but drained her. If you deliver her, I might even let you live. Interesting. From what he'd heard thus far, Kakuzu was as greedy as Kakashi himself was perverted. Should it be taken as an honor to be considered so troublesome that he'd warrant a reprieve? Let me think about that. The woman by his side sent him a betrayed look before it soured, and she hissed at him, both of which he ignored as an unassuming finger tapped on his chin. I think I'll have to pass. He smiled at Yujito. At least that is what she interpreted as his eyes squinting and the ragged mask tightening. Doing something like that would be a failure to both the mission as well as my comrades. If I were the kind of person to do such a thing, there's no way I could consider myself anything lower than the lowest pieces of trash. Kakuzu scoffed at the sentimentality. It's your funeral. It was possible, and this narrow valley would be their doom. Neither he nor Jujutsu had been able to eliminate the threat posed by the elemental masks stitched to the man's back. They might have killed the man a total of 3 times and destroyed 2 of the masks, letting him govern the natures of lightning and water. But all that was for naught if they could not survive the next 30 seconds. You have a plan? The exhausted Jinchuriki asked him, herself having dueled the two Akatsuki for gods know how long before they arrived. I was kinda hoping you would. If he'd a clear shot earlier, he might have been able to do something. possibly use the fabled Kamui to suck the man into another dimension, but at the moment that kind of chakra drain would surely kill him. He wasn't even sure if they would be able to make a run for it. The chasm they were in funneled all of Kakuzu's attacks, and the next one would surely engulf whatever there was to burn in its path, turning the fragment stone to glass in its wake. I wish, standing tall against their sure demise, Yujito quit nursing her shoulder where she narrowly dodged the zombie man's threads and sent him a defiant look. Well then, what do you suggest we do? Hold on. The suggestion came not from Kakashi, but she was all too happy to follow it nonetheless, even when the world stopped vibrating and her spinning head came to a crashing halt. She was only too happy to be able to be out of the chasm and back in the sun. Someday she would get the taste of vomit out of her mouth. Sorry, I don't think I've ever shunshin that far before. That familiar voice caused her to stop her heaving and glanced up. Her belly was long since empty anyway. You again? Does this mean you've dealt with the other one? Naruto ignored her displeasure and answered his captain's question with a cocky smile. Not yet. They only noticed the roar of Kakuzu's combination technique when it was gone, dwarfed by an organic explosion which shook the earth under their feet and sent spiderweb cracks skittering all around like they were not standard on a plateau, but on a pillar of glass. Behind Naruto's still smiling visage, they could hear immense fractures letting loose boulders down onto the crag below. After a few more seconds of landscape alteration, the air which had been trapped underneath the falling rocks escaped upwards in a squall of suspended dust and debris, a grand finale if ever there was one. Don't you think that was a bit excessive? Naruto shook his head, and Yujito found herself agreeing with the boy. There wasn't a fate too dismal for those monsters. That Hidan guy was immortal. The best thing to do would just be to hide him where he can't heal and no one can find him. Where's Sasuke and Tenten? They should have made it out the front by now. Besides, I only set up charges where we were fighting, so the whole canyon shouldn't be filled in. Over at the far edge, they heard more mountains moving and felt additional tremors cascading off the backs of the originals. Oops! Despite his aloof and childish attitude, or perhaps because of it, Yujito was intrigued by her fellow Jinchuriki. She missed the dialogue when it came to the older ninja scolding him about excess force and taking care of his comrades. Focus entirely devoted to figuring out this puzzle. Just how strong was this boy if he could take out an Akatsuki member without a scratch? Sure, she certainly helped her wear him down, her and her deceased comrades, but it was a feat nevertheless, and it was impossible to deny the iconic triple-bladed scythe jury-rigged to his back, something she was about to comment on when her own precognition kicked in and threw her backwards out of the way as a torrent of fibers erupted from the ground like magma. I have to say, I'm surprised there isn't a bounty on you yet, kid. The oddly calm voice they had all come to dread spoke from the black silhouette within the dust cloud. An inhuman cephalopod, a shadow undulating like a sea anemone in an unseen current. Normally, I tell you to run along until we're ready to collect you, but you've proven yourself to be too much of a nuisance with that little stunt. Clutching the overburdened weapon in his hands once again, Naruto interjected himself in front of his captain and fellow container, unsure of what he could honestly hope to do against such a powerful opponent, but adamant about doing it nonetheless. Do you know how long it'll take me to find that moron in all this mess? You didn't even have the decency of saving the arm with the ring on it. A thick bundle of threads gestured flimsily to the other end of the side tether, to which Hiran's right arm was still attached. If I could just get the ring back, I'd leave him there, but now I have to listen to the idiot whine some more, not to mention all that time wasted when I could be collecting the bounties on those Kumo shinobi. Naruto could feel Yujito's righteous fury behind him, funneling the anger at the callous treatment of her comrade into his own dedication. I'll give you the same deal I did the copycat ninja. Give me the nibby, and I'll let you live a little bit longer. You'll get a few more months to say goodbye before we come for you. The way he shrugged his shoulders was unhurried and casual, despite his vocal reluctance to waste time. Or you could go ahead and try to use that weapon you can barely lift. See if you can defeat me before our backup arrives. You're bluffing. He had to be. Akatsuki's worked in pairs, not in teams. That's the question, isn't it? Kakazu cocked his head amidst the mess of threads swallowing his torso. I don't have a reason to, do I? Are you willing to take that chance? With a mild nonplus at the teen's sudden burst of speed and dodging the ancient shinobi's first combo, Kakazu felt himself annoyed at having an upstart ignoring his sermon. Kids these days, what he didn't know wouldn't hurt him, as near as Naruto figured it. If there indeed were more S-rank ninja on their way, he would deal with it later. Unwittingly, Kakazu's attempt at intimidating lit a fire of urgency in the blonde shinobi, sprung him to take down the nuke nin before help could arrive. So, with frantic energy, Naruto rushed to the heart, controlling the thick tentacles, hacking with the burdensome weapon, which strained at his muscles with every swing. Apart from his protesting body, his soul felt somehow complete, swinging that essential blade, and it gave him a confidence as each swing fell into its natural course. Twirling like a baton in his hands, he battered away one thick bundle before ducking down and sliding underneath another, only to leap upward and draw the scythe with him, catching the diameter and plucking it like an overgrown facial hair. Enough! Whether at the word or with the unrelenting harvest of his previous threads, the swelled yarn either retracted back into Konkosu's body or else flopped off into overcooked spaghetti. The dying warm the dying worms, as they squirmed, provided the perfect cover as stone spikes sprouted in bushels around the QB's jinchuriki. Naruto flickered from plateau to plateau. Each pause ended as another drilling spike made him leave his perch. It looked like they were chasing him, but he knew he was being herded. This was confirmed as he ran out of soft space to jump to and found himself in thin air. Thin air suddenly turned solid as a condensed ball of it slammed into him and threw him further at the mess's edge. Though managing to right himself in the short jaunt, he found himself suddenly coming up short as the scythe jerked in his hand, or rather it stayed put as he continued to sail. Hangman at the end of the nose, he came to a sudden stop and plunged into the unforgiving rock. There was little time to shrug it off as Kakuzu began to reel him in by the tether's trailing end, and he found himself dragged against the rough surface, not for the first time glad of his durable jacket. The tether was made of something incredibly durable and flexible. If he didn't know any better, he would have thought it was some modern alloy from Remnant. In his hands, it was proving more detriment than benefit, as he was reluctant to use the other end with the severed limb still attached. Something which didn't seem to bother Kakazu, which meant it was just something else he'd come to overcome. He couldn't afford squeamishness. Rather than resist the incessant tugging on his arms, he went with it, yanking himself bodily towards the culvert. Up on his feet, in an instant he swung the scythe in an upward diagonal, forcing the ex-Taki shinobi to let go of the dismembered limb and dodge the whistling strikes. You're not bad with that thing, boy. I can see how you managed to defeat Hidan. It's almost like you've used one before. The man's cotton-filled mouth barked the offhand compliment as his leg snaked out and snapped at Naruto's knee, forcing a mute cry from his own lips. You could say that. It was only one of the biggest compliments the zombie man could have given him, and precipitated a redoubling of his efforts along with an ear-splitting smile. The smile was too short-lived, as his blade was caught barehanded with a casual raise of the man's hand. Skill alone isn't going to be enough to defeat me, though. The sensible thing would have been to abandon the scythe. It wasn't even technically his yet, but in that moment when the flame and wind masks stared at him with their hollow sunken eyes, he lost rationality and clung onto the handle like it was a lifeline. The spiral ball of chakra he formed in his hand had been delayed by that moment of hesitation just a little too much before he was incinerated by the swelling point blank attack. This wasn't this was going to hurt. Ah! The chakra feeling the attack petered out and caused him to let go of Naruto's blade, or maybe it was the other way around, or perhaps there was some root cause to all the symptoms that he hadn't seen yet. In any case, he did not hesitate this time to shred the nigh immortal shinobi in front of him, triple-bladed scythes making just as many passes at the man who had braced his arms uselessly to stave off the vindictive strikes. He kicked the pile of several limbs held on by shoestrings far away, wary of the man's regenerative capabilities, and himself needing to catch breath. Once cleared, the body revealed a welcome sight. Neji! The boy simply bowed his head, no words wasted in heedless banter, as his all-seeing eyes attracted the legendary shinobi as he struggled to put himself back together. More of you? You're lucky I'm on another mission, Hyuga. Those eyes of yours would fetch a pretty penny, maybe even strike a deal with Kumo. Kakuzu slowly regained his footing, detached arms being slurred up by the threads within the man's very body. Still, that just cost me another heart. I suppose I need a replacement. Chidori! The crackling sound was just a drone as the fist, sparkling with electricity, plowed through the man's puzzled piece chest, silencing whatever menace had been on his sewn shut lips. Better make that two. Are you offering copycat? They were not going to give the man a chance to make good on those threats. Just when the remaining masks on his back started to swivel in position, they were cut shortly. They were cut short, literally, as Naruto, in one mighty swing, decapitated them and got halfway to do so with the man himself, his head held on by a flapping piece of flesh. You're really starting to piss me off. Take up your beef with her. Suddenly both Naruto and Kakashi were no longer near him, and Kakasu found himself alone with his too large flickering shadow. Nice kitty. An odd thing to hear fire sound so wet, but there was no other way to describe the salivating maw of the giant feline composed of a blue hot inferno, chomping down on what remained of the Koski member, emaciating him into nothing but a molten mush before swallowing his very foul-tasting essence, only able to watch the transformed Yujito Gorgo herself on the then hopeless Kakuzu for so long. Naruto turned to his recently arrived friend, letting the strain finally get to him and resisting his weight on the staff in front of him. Thanks for the quick save, but what about the others? And also, aren't you worried about? He shot a look at the demon cat with two tails flicking contentedly behind it. What would only be occupied with its treat for so long? More Kumo shinobi arrived, so I switched with Sasuke. Neji shot a narrowed look at the oddly plebeian-looking creature, which was now licking the azure flames on its paw imperturbably. At least there's only one to do with over here. In the moment Naruto nodded, said Kunoichi reverted back to her human form, the flames dancing off into the early afternoon sun and leaving behind a bedraggled woman who, fittingly, looked like something the cat dragged in. It wasn't a pun, but Naruto was still glad Ruby couldn't hear that personal thought. With as much dignity and grace as her weary body could muster, Yujito plotted her way over to him, sparing only a slight flickering glance at his stern teammate, who regarded her with arms crossed defensively. It was only then that he noticed the equally wrung-out Kakashi take up his other side silently, though he too was more bark than bite right then. There was palpable tension in the stare-down, and Naruto gut-wrenchingly wondered if she was considering finishing what her village had started almost a decade ago. Your comrades are here to collect you. Surprisingly, it was Neji who delivered the first word, breaking the impasse that perhaps he had only imagined. It'd be best to rejoin them before Sasuke gets bored with toying with them. The two-tailed Jinchuriki seemed to take offense at having someone speak ill of her comrades, and whether it was true or not boded ill for their relations. It was easy to understand and sympathize. After all, they had wade through the field of corpses before finding her, and Naruto was just about to speak in this effort when she turned to him abruptly. That scythe! Her icy words betrayed by a trembling hand gripping the handle of her battered ninjato. or not leaving without it. Out of all the things that could have become an issue, this one was totally unexpected and part of the reason he never planned ahead, though perhaps he should have at least though about his words before they came out of his mouth, because it came pretty obvious that it wasn't the ideal thing to say in that situation. No, you can't have it. That blade slew 20 of my comrades. No one was arguing the reality of Hedon reaping the shinobi, likely tortured a number of them before he mercilessly ended their lives, but it was a symbol of his vile nature, his arrogance, and his prowess. Why shouldn't I get it? From what I understand, it was Naruto who defeated its previous owner. The half step forward that Neji took might as well have been a fist raised to her face. By all rights, it should be his to do so with what he wants. Those words were calm and collected on both sides, the argument seemingly a petty squabble conducting poisonous undercuts that would kill any sort of fecund relationship that their actions had sown. Naruto held the Cold War that he precipitated past him by as he sought out the crux of the conflict. Why was the scythe so important to her? She claimed it was because it was a symbol of their enemy's defeat, an enemy that had been in all truth seeking her and her alone. They were interlopers in this affair, as they knew they would be seen. It was silly, it was insane. But then again, that seemed to be a common thread these days. Apart from that, it was a symbol of her guilt. She bore far more gashes in her clothing than there were wounds to show, and carried herself far more worrisomely than the short fitted had suggested. For the short fight had suggested, as if she'd been fighting for days and not hours. The wounds she bore were internal, the outside healed, but the breach of her defenses still festering somewhere within, and not something the Nibi could heal for her. The Katsuki had frightened her, made the invincible woman feel exposed, and this was her psyche seeking some sort of resolution. It was not the right way to deal with it, though. Naruto knew because he'd had the same rude awakening not long ago. He'd long since learned to live with that fear. Maybe it was just his greed leading him, but he knew what he was talking about. Yujito-san, the single blow would have felled her right then, but even still her obstinance was ready to start another fight with her supposed saviors over a piece of metal with true value only left to him. His subdued voice ended things before it began, though. You don't want this thing, shrugging the solid blade wantonly. You don't need a trophy to constantly remind of you of your hatred. Just let it go. I promise it'll go to good use. To him, it was so much more. Maybe fate finally giving him something overdue. He would use it to protect his precious people, including her, if she would allow it. An angry bark was on her lips, but it came out as a pitiful moan when he ripped off the bandage and let the wound cleanse. It was it was supposed to be a routine mission, a cakewalk, but someone had turned that perfect life upside down right in her face. Naruto could understand that. What then did they die for? I need something. One body was not enough to state her hunger for revenge. He knew this. What he could never know was how her life had compared to his, so alike and yet so different. One slip and it could have been Neji's face, Sasuke's, Tenten's, Yamato's, any number of his friends' visage on those lifeless corpses. The fact that it wasn't could be attributed to fate or sheer dumb luck, which was it in the end that stuck with him in the with the ninth Biju, which was it that stuck with Ruby, which stuck him with Ruby. You still have your life, don't you? Naruto's words flowed from Neji's mouth. I think that you. That I think that your comrades would be happy with that. Honor them by living it the best you can. It was a statement derived from experience, the same thing which glinted in a wise man's eyes and marked the rings on a tree. It was a hard-earned truth which allowed Neji to say that, and Yujito witnessed him drying her tears and composing herself in front of these strangers who had done so much for her. Go home, Yujito. Anything added on to that felt unnecessary, but Naruto said it anyway. You'll have an advantage now, knowing that they're after you, but don't hesitate to seek out help. I'll be there if I can. He felt pathetic that he couldn't promise anything, but the woman had her own comrades, clearly people that were important to her, as did he. You're right, she said to both of them. You've earned that blade, and more. A simple nod sufficed for the unsaid thanks as the nervous retrieval team from Kumo approached, trailing a good distance behind Sasuke, who deigned to escort them. With the simple gesture, they knew they had her gratitude, something far more valuable than a simple trinket. The rest of the mission would end with a rather anticlimactic diminudo. Forces of the Detente dispersed hurriedly to the seven winds. It struck them as oddly wanting, or perhaps simply odd, especially with the muscle-bound swordsman who greeted both parties with undue enthusiasm and lyrical speech. Naruto should have known him, or at least marked him as important. Not only did the dark-skinned Kumonin acknowledge Sasuke with a significant nod, but there was a certain chill within himself as well. But that sensation he should have recognized was ignored. Instead, he was consumed by that searching look on Yujito's visage, which continued up until her form was swallowed into the fold of black and white clad bodies. What did that lingering look signify, and what sort of meaning was conveyed in the words left unsaid? It was a never-ending struggle to read in between the lines. End of chapter 20.